Cocaine Cowboys, the deadly rise of Ireland's drug lords. The live show is on sale now. We're on the road on February 10th at the Lime Tree Theatre in Limerick, February 15th in Cork's Everyman Theatre, and on Sunday 18th, we're back at Dublin's 3 Olympia. April takes us to Galway's Town Hall Theatre, Killarney's INEC, and Belfast's Waterfront Studios. Check mcd.ie or venue for ticket sales. Clodagh has just said, and just so as people don't think it's just me that's past remarkable, that you look like the presenter from Blue's Clues. I've never seen this.
Yeah. I presume he looks like George Clooney, as I said to her. I just presume that's the only him or what's it, Tom Hardy, some mix. No, he doesn't look like George Clooney.
Kevin Duala, for anybody who wants to Google him.
Yeah.
Duala.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that, Clodagh. If he looks like him, I can totally get that they have the same jumper on. And there seems to be other presenters as well. That looks like Robbie Farrell.
Yeah, it does. Glasses. It does.
And the little hat.
Again, this doesn't work as well for the vast majority of people who listen to it.
Now because she's usually not as past remarkable as I am. Anyway, Marco Yaqout, and he hopes that his family and friends had maybe that there would be some justice brought against his killers, were dashed this week when 2 men were acquitted of his murder. Yaqout was shot dead in Spain. Are we talking 2019? I'm just trying to remember.
Yeah, it was January the 20th, 2019.
Yeah.
He would have been fair, I think, to call him a kind of a playboy figure in Porto-Banús, which of course is a particularly wealthy bit of Spain. Certainly even more so, I think, back then, where there was a big, he would have been the owner of nightclubs, I think a lap dancing bar, very public figure, a kind of a socialite kind of guy. But there was obviously all these links to the underworld, and he seems to have served a purpose as maybe a money launderer on that in Porto-Banús for.
So there was a kind of a blast of shootings down around Banús, down around the Costa around that time, which isn't actually very frequent.
No.
You know what I mean? A lot of the violence isn't played out there because in similar fashion to Dubai, the criminals that like to hang around in those spots would know that you're better off not bringing the heat of the police on you. And in a way, there's a belief that their sort of activities are accepted as long as the violence doesn't play out on the streets and, you know, scare off the tourists, basically. But there was a kind of a number of shootings down around there. And at the time, it was being blamed on the Dutch Moroccans, which of course was the gang headed up by Ridouan Taghi, who was still at that point on the run because he wasn't picked up in Dubai until the end of that year. And very capable of ordering murders and is currently before the courts in the Netherlands for that very activity. But Yaqout, when the shooting happened, kind of unusually it filtered back here very quickly because I was told, I remember distinctly being told at the time that he was a friend of Daniel Kinahan. I was told he was sort of laundering money for him. Now, Porto-Banús remains one of the richest parts of that area of Spain. It is like a port. It's a little bit of a kind of a mini Monaco.
Yeah.
And it has always been, and it sort of attracts the legitimate wealth and illegitimate wealth. It's one of those weird places. It's a mixing pot of golfers and criminals, you know. And of course, our own Kinahan organisation once ran the port.
Yeah.
But yeah, he was running a couple of clubs and lap dancing clubs and all this around it. And it was suspected that he was laundering funds for the Kinahans. But they were never kind of linked to the murder, I don't think.
No, I mean, I think it was, these are cash businesses, of course, that he seems to have had a hand in, which are great for laundering money if you're running a lap dancing club. I imagine, one imagines that people don't pay by credit card as much as in some other businesses. So there is just a load of money coming in. The Kinahans were never linked to his murder, but I suppose you could say the wider super cartel was quickly blamed for his shooting. It made a lot of headlines at the time, Yaqout's murder, partly because he was shot in a UK registered Bentley. And there was very dramatic pictures of the aftermath. This wasn't a guy that was under the radar. He was kind of a public-facing sort of personality, had done a number of interviews in sort of local media, not about criminal aspects, just about in his business, associated with a lot of the kind of the celebrities, if you want, that are.
Was he not on that Taghi or whatever you call that show?
I don't think he was on that. Was he? Was he not a friend of somebody who was on it?
Lena.
Yeah, it was something like that. He wasn't. He may have been on an episode of.
Yes.
He wasn't. Yeah, he wasn't a.
Oh no, he wasn't a kind of a regular contributor to it. But
you're right,
have a feeling that he was friends with one of them, and that maybe they kind of visited his club, and he was on it as a kind of a guest star.
Yeah, I mean, and there was a wave of violence, as you said, and to an extent, I think it's probably dropped off in the last while. But there was probably in the aftermath of the Kinahans moving out en masse, there was, I think, a bit of a breakdown in the underworld there, and a bit of there was a lot of tensions, and there was a good lot of shooting, and it caused a lot of political fuss amongst the local media there, amongst the local politicians, saying this has to be stamped out, it can't go on. And the Marco Yaqout murder, which was probably the most public of them because of the way it was committed, because of the obvious wealth there, and because of the suspicions of the involvement of the Morocco Mafia, basically.
So he was actually driving into his home in that Bentley in San Pedro de Alcantara, which sits above Porto Banús up in the hills, some, absolutely beautiful mansion that he'd been living in out there. And he was shot, I think there was 14 bullets pumped into the car. He had no chance. But at the time, I recall being told he was friends with Daniel Kinahan. It seemed everybody was linked some way to Daniel Kinahan, particularly people dead with bullets in them.
Yeah.
It was always kind of like these associations, and you sort of had to dig a bit deeper than just accept that. And sure enough, I did actually find a photograph of Yaqout with, he was at the launch of Daniel Kinahan's boxing club.
Yeah.
MGM it was then called when it was founded around 2014, and he was basically at this sort of star-studded launch of it, and he was photographed with Matthew Macklin, Frank Warren, and the promoter Frank Maloney, who would later become Kelly Maloney.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain that?
No, I mean, look, the Frank Maloney was a very well-known boxing promoter who transitioned, did a lot of publicity around that. Not to get out of our lane on Crime World, but...
Well, he's in the photograph as Frank Maloney.
At the time, yeah.
So that was obviously in the aftermath of that.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, he was a kind of a star guest at that launch, at that very sort of public launch.
Yeah.
And clearly he was mixing with them all down in the Costa. And they, of course, were, for years, Daniel Kinahan and all his buddies and Matthew Macklin and all those boxers and everybody that was down around there hanging out with them, they went out clubbing all the time. There was all those nightclubs down around Porto Banús, I could name them off, that they had VIP tables in. They were mixing with everybody that was down and about there. the Irish owned Porto Banús. It was quite extraordinary. When myself and McCaffrey went down there in 2012, the Kinahans had the run of the place.
Yeah, and it was
extraordinary.
And it was a very different time for them as well, because despite the publicity in Ireland surrounding them, when they were in Spain, they weren't treated as gangsters by the celebrity people that were there. They were treated in a totally different way. People were happy to be pictured with them, happy to be associated with them publicly. And it was all going on.
I think what happens down there, and what's always happened traditionally back to the 80s when the Brits started going out there because there was no extradition treaty between Spain and
the Costa Del Crime, it was nicknamed.
I think what happened down there is you have this sort of merging of those two worlds very openly. And it's not as if people kind of go, he's a gangster, don't be photographed with them. I think it's all sort of pretty open, and they do know who everybody is, and they're all sort of just mixing around in the same circles. They've money. Yeah. And in the same way as a lot of kind of wealthy tourists from Ireland would go and visit that part of the world and holiday in Portabanús. It's a more expensive holiday, shall we say, than Benamedina or anywhere like that. So, you have the golfers and you have the kind of wealth. And they are mixing and without maybe realising, or sometimes the gangsters almost become sort of semi-celebrities in the area.
I think some people certainly like being around them. Because of their gangland connections, not in spite of them, but because of them. And then you had this other sort of crew of people that ended up there, these kind of dodgy financier types, didn't you, as well, who also seemed to merge and end up in Portabanús, and ultimately probably ended up in Dubai as well at a certain point. These guys who are kind of fraudsters, really, who are one foot in regular business and one foot out of it. And they seem to all mix in there as well about the movements of money. And I suppose, Yaqout was somebody along those lines, that he was trying to have a foot in both camps. He certainly seemed to have had long-term connections with the Dutch Moroccan gangs. We believe that he was related to some of the figures there, and rather than being maybe involved directly in the drugs business, he seems to be involved in the cleaning of money, or certainly that's the suspicion.
Certainly through some of the operations maybe he was running down there. Banús is a particular place. It is a little bit like I mentioned Monaco, and perhaps Saint-Tropez a little bit.
Yeah.
It's the place where these people go to peacock.
Yeah.
I mean, literally. So there's a port ticket you can buy every year, which means that you're able to come in and cruise. I mean, you wouldn't really want to be driving a car in there, because it's literally a little port with little narrow streets, and a lot of the restaurants and the bars are along the port, and then you have the clubs at the back, in the back streets. But it's busy. But the only reason that most people would bring their cars in there is to show them off. So you have like these convertible Bentleys. You can sit and watch this wealth going past you for hours on end, just in total fascination. You have the yachts where people pull in and they pay expensive berthing fees there in the harbour. Some of the yachts never move. They're just there so as they can go on and party and, show off again. You see an awful lot of very burly looking, sort of almost Eastern European types.
Yeah.
Tattooed from head to toe, and obviously working out with these very sort of dramatic looking females on their arm. And yeah, it's really, I mean, you can just watch the world go by, but you're not in Portabanús to hide.
No.
You're there to show off.
Yeah.
And that's what all these people do. And of course, Tibu nightclub is the one where the celebrities and the tourists party, but unknown to them, sometimes they're also partying with some of the biggest gangsters of Europe. And certainly that would have been a regular haunt for the Kinahan crew, who had and opened this gym we talk about, the MGM, which later became MTK, which later kind of rolled into causing problems for Kinahan just before the sanctions. But that gym was literally directly opposite the Tibu nightclub where it was. And of course, it's interesting, again, we talk about connections, that Yaqout was friendly, or was he in business with Richard Cashman, who was the former business partner. I think he was friendly with him, basically. I think he used to knock around with him. And Richard Cashman was the business partner of John Goldfinger Palmer, the famous gangster who made hundreds of millions out of timeshare fraud in Tenerife. Goldfinger Palmer was murdered in 2015 in the UK. His business partner, Richard Cashman, washed up in Dubai and was a guest at Daniel Kinahan's wedding.
Daniel Kinahan's very famous wedding now at this stage. And Cashman was there. I think he was one of the few people who actually put a couple of pictures on social media of the cake, I think, rather than...
photographed his wife, I think.
Yeah. But Goldfinger Palmer was, I suppose, very much a veteran criminal, wasn't he? He'd been involved with some of the gangs, involved in some of those really big heists back in the 80s and 90s. He'd come from that tradition, and then he'd gone and moved. He's one of the first generation to move to Spain, and he'd become involved in timeshare fraud, really, wasn't it? Where he was you'd buy a share in an apartment in Spain, but he seemed to have just got greedy and defrauded a load of people. But so he was kind of, I suppose he's something like a John Gilligan or a Martin Cahill, isn't he, in the English gangland, like as in one of those veterans who really made it to the top and became so well known in the British media. But amazingly, he was shot dead in 2015. I mean, it is an incredible story, really, what happened to him, in that he was shot from a distance. The police believe from an adjoining property. He collapsed. I think he was cutting his grass, was he? And he was found dead, and somehow they presumed he'd had a heart attack, wasn't it? So it was
buried him.
Did they bury him, or they
did bury him? Yeah.
So it seems to have been like a sniper shot. So it wasn't a shot to the head from a handgun that there's obvious damage. He was a big man, wasn't he?
It was a very neat little assassination. Is that what you're going to say?
Yes, it was. It's sort of a sniper bullet without loads of, I don't know. I mean, but it's still, you know, if that's an explanation for how it was missed, it does seem quite bizarre. He was a big guy, kind of, maybe. So I don't know. But either way.
He was 64 at the time, and he was shot 6 times, actually.
Was it?
And they didn't actually bury him.
Yeah.
No, that's a slight reach of exaggeration by myself. He was shot, actually, and they only discovered that during post-mortem. So they had moved the body and they hadn't realised.
So I think it was 48 hours or something like that before they realised he'd been shot. I mean, it's still an incredible story anyway. So it was it was a sort of a great mystery, wasn't it, who shot him now? He'd fallen out with a lot of people during his life. I mean, he'd sort of fallen out with everybody at some stage, including some of the most infamous gangland figures in the UK.
I suppose to ground him as, you know, how significant he is, because he's way above anybody that we could ever describe him as. But he was believed to have been involved in the Brinks mass robbery.
Exactly.
And he was involved with Brian Robinson and Mickey McAvoy. And I mean, they were the biggest gangsters that Britain pretty much had ever seen.
I mean, I think Goldfinger was meant to have been, rather than actually involved in the heist, but involved in the selling or moving the money in the aftermath, basically. And wasn't he caught with some of the incriminating evidence? Yeah.
That was one thing that he was involved in that. And then the timeshare. I mean, I have a book at home about him. I must give it to you, actually. It's really fascinating how he set up the timeshares and how he, he ran that scam. Timeshare in itself is a fascinating thing when you think about it. Yeah. You know, tourists were kind of like doorstepped on the streets and brought in, and they were convinced that they needed to buy 3 weeks in the same apartment in the same area for the rest of their lives. I mean, it was some sort of it goes on. I mean, it's still a big business in the US, but it's selling timeshare.
Yeah, in Florida. I mean,
I could just never understand, what is the point of it?
Well, I suppose it's that you get these guaranteed 3 weeks holidays, and then you have a sort of an asset.
In a hotel.
Well, you have this asset. So look, it appealed to a certain amount of people, but so he ran it, and it started to go wrong, and people started to come looking for the money. And of course, what happened then is he would set the heavies on them as well, because he had those gangland connections. But obviously, in the aftermath of his death, and because I think he'd fallen out with so many people, it was unclear about who wanted him dead. But amazingly, in a couple of years on, intelligence was revealed, I think during a court case in the UK, who one of the suspects was. And again, if you talk about everything being connected, let's have the big reveal.
Imre
Arakas was, who obviously...
my favourite hitman, and I don't mean that in that I like him. I just think, what a story, what an incredible character. You know, going back to his days in the Soviet Union, his imprisonment in the gulags, his, you know, rattling down to the Costa del Sol. Do you remember his boss down there? He was in a big sort of Eastern European Balkan mafia. Yeah. And his boss was a wheelchair-bound guy who denied he'd anything to do with any crime. And he had this sort of bald Sphinx cat that sat on his knee.
Yeah, colourful.
He was like something out of a James Bond movie.
He was. So,
as was Imre Arakas. Imre, I feel like calling him. He lost his looks in Irish prison. I've never seen anything like him. I have never seen anything. So he was jailed here. He was caught out in Blakestown cottages when he had flown in on a mission to kill James Mago Gately in 2017, shortly before that famous wedding in the Burj Al Arab. As Kinahan was preparing for that wedding, he was also trying to plot this murder. And he had come in dressed as a fishing enthusiast, didn't realise he was under surveillance, and he'd been arrested. So he was brought to court and charged with conspiracy to murder. But he was also, when he was caught here in Ireland, it was revealed he was wanted in Lithuania for the murder of a gangster by the name of Diamond.
Yeah.
And the Lithuanians very quickly came to Ireland and said, we'll have him when you're finished with him. Let him go through the justice system there. And if he gets jailed, we'll file an extradition request and we want him over to face charges in relation to that murder. So, of course, Imre Arakas was an extraordinary looking person.
Yeah.
I've never seen anything like him. Him tall, white, sort of blonde hair down his back, piercing blue eyes, looked almost like a Neanderthal, and of course had his own Facebook page and had done videos, and was handsome now in his day, but maybe when he was standing in the special criminal court he wasn't so. But the next vision we had of him after a few years in Portlaoise prison, despite telling his local media back in Estonia that it was really a walk in the park and the food was really good, he did look like a man who'd aged about 50 years, didn't he?
He did.
Where did that image come from of him giving the video testimony to Lithuania?
It came from the Lithuanian courts, who he obviously gave video testimony from the Irish prisons, who would never allow you to capture any images of that. I mean, you never see images of that type in the Irish media, but the Lithuanian media just took a picture of him as he came up on stage.
It was just one still as opposed to the video.
It was just one number of stills,
right.
So, and they took pictures within the courts of the defendants and all of that. So it's obviously just allowed over there.
Yeah. Just a different. Anyway, he had disimproved, I thought.
Yeah,
like the good food and all the rest of it.
Yeah. Well,
slight aside. We
slight aside on his
segued into that a little bit.
But in the aftermath of that accusation, which it was at the time, that he was involved in this murder in Lithuania, which also had a bizarre link in that it was a Lithuanian pop star was gone out with the murdered guy, which made it huge news again in that country. But in the aftermath, as part of the Goldfinger investigation, it emerged that Imre Arakas had also been, it was believed he was in the area at the time when Goldfinger was shot dead, and he became a suspect, never been charged, obviously, but there was various bits of intelligence to link him to that. Not enough, obviously, to prosecute him, but enough to certainly
see him as a suspect. And, he was working at that time for gangs, including the Kinahans, including the Mokra Mafia down on the Costa in Marbella. He was a hitman for hire. He also, and his MO, his modus operandi was to get up close and personal with his victims. So he liked being, getting them into his sights. He liked stalking them for a long time. He's a creepy character. He almost would like to brush past them. And, when
he was arrested for the Lithuanian murder, I don't know if you remember the amazing pictures of his masks. He had a series of masks and stuff like that. Obviously, the Lithuania case, one of the defenses he made, Imre Arakas, was that he didn't know this guy who was shot dead. He'd no animosity. He'd never met him. He'd no motive to kill him. But that is what, obviously, the prosecution's case was, that Arakas was a specialist hitman for hire, and he was hired to kill these high-profile people. And obviously then the murder of Goldfinger would fit that sort of pattern, I suppose, in that there was nobody saying Arakas had a falling out with him directly, but it certainly seems to be a suggestion that he would have been the type of person that you would have turned to if you wanted to carry out a high-profile hit of this type.
So, of course, in the weeks leading up to his death, Palmer and 10 others, including Richard Cashman, were all due to stand trial over sort of real estate fraud in Tenerife.
Yeah.
And there was speculation at the time that Palmer was seeking a deal with the prosecutors. Of course, then he shows up in Dubai with Kinahan, and the story becomes even more interesting. But as far as I know, he was never brought back Cashman. He had moved from Spain to Dubai after the UK police quizzed him in connection with the murder of his former boss, but he never kind of had to come back to face trial in relation to any of the fraud in Tenerife. Or he's obviously, look, I mean, we talk about the Kinahans trying to get them back. What chance have Tenerife got?
Well, very little, you know. And I mean, I think it was even suggested at the time that there was also unproven intelligence to link James Quinn to the Goldfinger murder. And there was, at least it was reported at the time, that he could have been, he was also in a person of interest in that investigation, along with Arakas.
Yeah. So anyway, all these people surrounded Yaqout and Marco Yaqout and you know, surrounded him in social circles. They were friends and all the rest of it. And obviously so much has gone on there. There's almost an encyclopedia in it, really, when you think about what happened in the Costa over those few years and then onwards to Dubai. But nonetheless, the cops on the Costa have been investigating Yaqout's murder, and they did put 2 men on trial, but they were acquitted. Yeah,
I mean, the reports don't name them fully, but they're named as Badr K and Omar C. They're described as being from the Netherlands and links to the Morocco mafia. They were also suspected of the murder of a lawyer in counsel for a state witness in the Marengo trial.
Dirk Werstein.
Yes, Dirk Werstein. So the reason they were charged by the Spanish police was their mobile phones were spotted in the vicinity of Yaqout, and that was one of the big Yaqout's movements on the night, and that was one of the big suspicions. However, they were found not guilty last week, and it's, you know, that I would say the chances of somebody else coming to justice for this murder are now becoming.
And are they
small.
Still suspected in relation to the murder of? It's actually Dirk Werstein.
Yeah.
Is the pronunciation of his name? Are they still suspected in connection?
Well, that's how it's described
in court.
By the Dutch media have described them as suspects in that murder. They had been in pre-trial in detention in Spain for 3 or 4 years. So they're basically pre-trial detention, I think, is kind of soft enough in Spain, but basically they were being monitored. And there was another Dutch national, a guy described as Jermaine B was his name. He was also initially accused, but I think he was found not guilty as well at an earlier point, and he's since been sentenced to life in Netherlands for a separate murder case. So it's clear where, Badr K was ultimately sentenced to 25 years for the murder of a person called Shaquille Goudart in 2019 in Amsterdam as well. So these are very much figures within the Morocco mafia. So
he was acquitted of the Yaqout.
Yeah.
Or certainly he was suspected of Yaqout, but not brought to trial on it.
This is Jermaine B. Yeah.
And then he was subsequently found guilty of Macra Mafia murder up in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Which would suggest that Taghi was in charge of a kind of a gang of killers from his own in-house, and that they were sent out wherever in the world he needed them.
Yeah, I mean, the motives are unclear, but you can be guaranteed it's to do with money.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just the way it is, and it could be nothing else, you know.
It always comes back to money. Thank you, Niall.
Thank you, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.